Okay, we're in Genesis chapter 16 and 17. The first question reads, what promise did the angel give Hagar about Ishmael? This is in Genesis 16, looking at verse 10. The angel said, I will increase your descendants, that they will be too numerous to count. Now, that promise is very similar to the promise God gave to Abram in chapter 15 of Genesis, verse 5. God tells him to look up to the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be, too numerous to count. The same promise, very similar promise to the promise that he gave to Hagar concerning Ishmael. The second question, where did Ishmael's name come from? Back in Genesis 16, verse 11, you shall call his name Ishmael. This is the angel speaking, and this is actually, trivial, maybe trivial, but it's the first time in the Bible that a child is named by God. And so Abram has the fact that the promise that had been given to him was given to Hagar concerning Ishmael. He has the fact that God names the child. He also has the fact, going into chapter 15 again, that when he suggested that Eliezer would be the inheritor of his estate, God responds to him in verse 4, this shall not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. Well, Ishmael did come from his body. And there's no mention here of Sarai being the one whose body through whom the child would come. So these three come into the next question. Based on this, what do you think Abram concluded about Ishmael and the fulfillment of God's promises to him? I believe it's very reasonable to conclude that Abram believed that this child, Ishmael, was the fulfillment of God's promises to him. He believed that this was the fulfillment of God's promises to him. We'll keep going and then we'll talk about this and how it applies to us. The next question, how long was it before God spoke to him about this? The end of chapter 16, the last verse, verse 16, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. And chapter 17, the very next verse, verse 1, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him, and then he speaks to him and actually clarifies and makes him to understand that it's through Isaac who Sarah would bear. This is verse 21. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. So 13 years go by with Abram believing that Ishmael is the son of promise, that Ishmael is the fulfillment of the promises of God. The next question, what do you think Abram could have done to avoid holding this misconception for so long? Well, we see this throughout the Bible, the very simple thing of asking God, of questioning, is this the way of the Lord? Is this the fulfillment of God's promise? And being willing to submit that to God and ask God to help him to know whether that were true or not. Now, this is easy, of course, for us to say in hindsight, looking back and being critical of Abram, but this is very similar to what I know I have done and what we're tempted to do in our Christian walk today. That's the last question. How can this apply to us? All of us, like Abram, have promises of God that he's given to us. Many promises. Promises general that he's given to all Christians, and promises specific that he may have given to you. But with these promises, there comes a cooperation. There comes a work that we have to do in harmony with God's work to fulfill these promises. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul refers to us as being laborers together or co-laborers with God in the work of evangelism. Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. A yoke, of course, is for at least two oxen to carry and to bear the burden. So Jesus is saying that, yes, I'm pulling this, but you also are doing your part as well. There's a cooperation between us and God. But with that cooperation comes the temptation for us to work outside of God's way to fulfill God's will. This is the temptation, and this was the sin of Abram and Sarah. They are trying to cooperate with God, but they go outside of God's way, trying to accomplish God's will. And not only did they do this, but after it was done, and after there was a result from it that seemed positive, then they assumed that this was God's work and this was the fulfillment of God's will. I'll give a quick example of how we have this temptation as well today. God has given the promise to supply all of our needs according to his riches in glory. But with that, we have to do something. We have to cooperate. We have to try and find a job. We have to do some work. We have to be faithful in that job and make sure we're doing what we need to do responsibly to work with God to supply our needs. But many times comes the temptation when times are hard, when the money's not going as far as it needs to be, to step outside of God's way to accomplish his will, which we know is for our needs to be supplied. And we have the promise of God that he will supply all our needs. And sometimes we actually go outside of his will, his ways. And then when we see positive results from that going outside of his ways, we're tempted to follow the example of Abraham and assume, well, this was God's blessing. And we sometimes, even I've done this before, praise God for things that really we have done and they have accomplished what we think to be God's will. It's a very dangerous position to be in because we can never imagine, we can never estimate, we can never understand how far will be the pain, how far will be the negative consequences of stepping outside of the will of God. And this was also the experience of Abram here. As a result of this mistake, 13 years itself was a long time to be living in darkness concerning God's will. But then even after that, you remember a few chapters later, he has to send away his son Ishmael and has to go through the heartache of separating from his child who he loved dearly. We can never estimate the consequences of stepping outside of the will of God. Now, yes, God did bless and God still provided Isaac, which shows that God can, for ourselves, I know he has done it for me, can still help us and can bring us back on track, but there will be loss. When we step outside of God's will, there will be loss. But God can help. God can bring us back and still bless and still bring us to a fulfillment of his will in his ways. But we ought to be very careful to work, yes, with God, to cooperate with him, but work in harmony with his ways, to work in harmony with trusting in him, even if what he said seems impossible, even if what he's promised seems like it cannot be true, cannot be realized, still trust that God will do what he said he will do. And let's keep our responsibility focused only on what we are to do in harmony with the ways of God.